welcome Dr. Juan Cole. We are really happy to have you here and we appreciate your time. We have so far discussed parts of your manifesto as well as your recent book, and we have had group discussions so far, and we have some questions ready which Dr. Quddusi actually engaged with some of them, and we are hoping to hear the answers to those questions from you too. I just want to give a very brief introduction of Dr. Juan Cole. He is a professor of history in the University of Michigan. For 3.5 decades, he has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in a historical context. He is the author of Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, as well as many other books, including The New Arabs, Engaging the Muslim World, and Napoleon's Egypt. He's the editor and creator of the award-winning Informed Comments News and Commentary website, which averages 4.5 million page views a year. He has made various television, radio, and press appearances. He has written widely about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and South Asia. Professor Cole commands Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and reads Turkish. He has translated works of the Lebanese-American author Khalil Gibran, and most recently published a new translation of the Persian famous Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. We are really happy to have you here, Dr. Cole, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers and Dr. Shirazi for the kind invitation to speak. People who are reading my work are my favorite audience, so I'm very pleased to see you all and to have this opportunity to discuss things. I want to preface my remarks with a little bit of autobiography. I was from a U.S. Army family. I was never in the Army, but my father was in it for 20 years and was in the Signal Corps. And we got sent when I was a teenager to, of all places, Asmara, now Asmara, Eritrea. At that time, it was under Ethiopian rule. And lived there for 18 months. At a very formative time in my life. And Eritrea is about a third Muslim. There are mosques in Asmara, and we had Muslim friends. It was the time of the first Yemeni civil war, and people came over from Yemen as kind of diplomatic refugees to the base that the Americans had there in Asmara. So at an early age, I had my eyes opened to a different civilization and became very interested in it. And then when we came back to the States, it was the full bloom of the 60s and early 70s counterculture. And people were very interested in what were then called Oriental religions, including Islam. I have to say mostly the youth were interested in Sufism. And so I continued to read, and ultimately when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, I became a religion major, and we were asked to to study more than one religious tradition. So I mainly focused on Buddhism and Islam. And I started taking Arabic, and I had an opportunity when we came back from Eritrea, we came back through Beirut and had some what was called rest and recreation in Beirut. I was 15 and I liked Beirut. At the time, it was a lovely city, and it still is. It has a lot of natural beauty coming down from the mountains to the sea. So when I was an undergraduate, I had an opportunity to go back to Lebanon on a research project for 2 quarters, and I designed one on Christian-Muslim dialogue, because after the Vatican II Council, the Roman Catholic Church had sponsored Christian-Muslim dialogue meetings in Beirut. And I wanted to interview the people who were involved and also to do a research project on the background of the relations between the two. And ultimately, then I went to UCLA, where I did a PhD in Islamic studies, and I got interested in Iran and Shiism because of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which I lived through in Beirut, which was a very interesting place to experience it. But as a young person in the late 60s, early 70s, and I know it now sounds like the Jurassic era, I was very interested in the origins of Islam and the whole history of Islam from the beginnings to the present. And I read a lot of Sirah literature, of the biographies of the Prophet. I did an MA at the American University in Cairo before I went to UCLA, and I studied the Quran with Egyptian scholars, and I studied history and Sirah and Usul al-Fiqh and the Islamic sciences. So I got pulled into modern history, I think in part by the Iranian Revolution, and now in my elder years, I've gone back to some of my early interests, and especially in the Quran and the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. And I have to say that these are subjects that are interesting to me beyond the merely academic. I find a certain amount of sustenance for the soul in these subjects. And I have been dismayed, both in the Middle East and the wider Muslim world and in the West, to find that my understanding, at least, of these matters is widely contested, and in ways that I think are very negative. And so there's been the rise in the United States and Europe of a virulent and Islamophobia and a kind of approach to early Islam that vilifies it, which is not new in Christian culture. It goes back to the time just after the Prophet. But then you had the rise of these extremist groups, Al-Qaeda and then ISIL, and others who, will quote half of a Quran verse. And it reminds me, there was the great early Muslim writer, Al-Jahiz, who was a literary specialist, and he has a book about the misers, Al-Bukhala, and people made fun of misers. It was a kind of extended joke. And one of the stories Al-Jahiz tells is that in the Quran, miserliness is forbidden and criticized. And there's a verse of the Quran that begins, and those who commit miserliness, and Al-Jahiz says that the misers would just quote the first half of the verse as though the Quran were praising them and wouldn't go on to the condemnation. I find the same thing in these extremist groups, that they have a very odd reading of the Quran. And so I wanted to go back and write about the things I saw in the Quran and in the life of the Prophet, which I think are a more balanced approach to the subject, and an approach that I found lacking not only in Western and Middle Eastern popular culture and movements, but also even in academia. I have this blog, and I was arguing with the Americans because I would quote the Quran, and they would say, "Oh, well, that's not in the Quran," and I would say, "Well, it is too." So as I got into this, being a historian, we historians are all about context, change over time, causality. We wouldn't ever just pull out a series of Quran verses and discuss them in the way that a philosopher or a theologian might do in an abstract matter. We want to set the verses in their historical context as far as we can. And I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with historical context because they think it robs the text somehow of its universality. But actually, the Muslim tradition has acknowledged this from the very beginning. There's an entire genre of writing called Asbab an-Nuzul, which is about the context of when the verses came down. And we modern historians don't accept everything that those authors said, but the principle was acknowledged in Islam, maybe in a way that it hadn't been so much in other religions, that the revelation has a context. And it's important to understand the context to understand what the verses are saying. So this is approach that we historians have in the modern academy is nothing alien to the Muslim tradition. And it doesn't prevent the verse from speaking universally. That's the great virtue of some works, that they had a context in which they arose, and individuals and communities are addressed in them, but what is said transcends that particular moment and goes on to be beloved and quoted and cited in a wide range of subsequent cultures. And that's certainly the case for the Quran. So I decided to try to write a book to talk about the peace verses in the Quran and the role of peace and conciliation in the life of the Prophet as far as we can recover it. And in order to do that, I had to find out more than I originally knew about the 500s and early 600s of the Common Era, and spent years reading late Roman history, basically, and Sasanian history, because I also am a Persianist, and trying to see the context in which the Quran grew up. And I was astonished to find that, with a few exceptions, there's a great classicist named Glenn Bowersock, who finished up his career at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. And Bowersock's books are very well worth reading. With the exception of Bowersock and a handful of others, this work of putting the rise of Islam in the wider context of the late Roman and the Sasanian empires really hadn't been much attended to. And a lot of Western academic scholars had given up on studying very early Islam. Because, you know, there's the problem that we academics want primary sources. The primary source is a first-person account, ideally, by an eyewitness. And we want a range of them. So there aren't any first-person accounts by an eyewitness of early Islam that we can be sure about. There are later Sirah material and hadith and all kinds of things which are voluminous and fill volumes, but they get collected very late, the early 800s, about something that's happening in the 610s and 620s. So I'm not saying that you have to throw them all out or they're not reliable. I'm just saying you can't be sure. As a historian, you can't be sure. Something that's so late and is oral. And people, remember things differently over time. Their memories change. Subsequent generations remember certain things rather than others. Folk tales get invented, and Muslim scholarship admits that there's a problem with, phony hadith, and has a whole science to try to weed them out. So because we don't have a primary source for the life of the Prophet that we can be sure is early, a lot of Western academics have avoided writing about the subject, and there's been a whole school called revisionism, which made fun of people who tried to write about it, given the lateness of the sources. And the revisionists actually thought that the Quran itself might be late. And there's this mirror fallacy, I think, in Western academia when it comes to approaching the Quran, because people want to assume that it's like the New Testament or like the Hebrew Bible, that it's like the scriptures of our traditions, and it's not. The New Testament, the Gospels, the four Gospels, are, we think, what is remembered by four different communities. Maybe, a village in the Galilee or the city of Antioch. We're not sure which exactly the communities were, but four different communities, some Aramaic-speaking Jewish, some maybe Greek-speaking Jewish and Gentile mixed. And they were stories that were remembered and circulated about Jesus, and they ultimately get written down. 70 years after his death, 90 years after his death, some people think 120 years after his death. So they're more like the Hadith. But I would argue that if you wanted an analogy in scholarship, not in real life, not in sacred history, but in scholarship, if you wanted an analogy for the Quran, it's like the epistles of the Apostle Paul, which scholars recognize at least some of them that are in the New Testament are authentic and go back to Paul and were written by Paul. And the Quran clearly is produced through the Prophet Muhammad, at least. Both Paul and the Prophet Muhammad thought that they were getting divine inspiration. But the vehicle, the physical vehicle, the historical vehicle were these individuals. And there have been a lot of new discoveries that have blown the revisionist story about these things out of the water. One of them is early Qurans, which have been carbon dated as early and which we know from the material that they're written on and the script, the Madani script of Medina that's used, as well as from the carbon dating, we know that they are early. And one of them, the Sana one manuscript, appears to be from before the standardization of the text under Othman in, we think, around 652. And so these early Qurans, in my view, established the Quran as the primary source. I mean, if you wanted to write a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, well, there you have it. You have something that's contemporaneous with him, in fact, which is a kind of, well, I would argue that the Quran contains biographical elements of the Prophet Muhammad. Sometimes in the voice of God, there's kind of a biography of the Prophet in the voice of God in the Quran. And if we read the Quran as a primary source for the life of the Prophet, it does look a little bit different from the Sira literature of the Abbasid period 200 years later, but not terribly different. And it's mostly very compatible with it. I think there are some puzzles. The Abbasids maintained that the Prophet Muhammad had a lot of wrangles with Jews, that some Jews tried to assassinate him, that there was a massacre of Jews by Muslims at Khaybar. That's not in the Quran. There are critiques of the Jewish community in the Quran, but they're generally spoken of in a very positive way. And there's not and there's nothing about massacring POWs. And in fact, the Quran says that prisoners of war should be released or ransomed. There's no principle in the Quran of treating them harshly. And so some of these later Abbasid stories seem to me to be, when you write as an author, you write from your own time and standpoint. And I think maybe some of these things were happening in the Abbasid period, and they get projected back by Al-Waqidi and others onto the time of the Prophet. Maybe there's a kernel of truth to some of these things. But, as a historian, I want to start with the Quran. And and then the things that in the later tradition that seem to me compatible with what's in the Quran are the ones that I want to give the most authority. And when I approached the Quran in this way, in the context of the biography of the Prophet and the times in which he lived, the Quran suddenly looked very different, because there are verses in the Quran, and you just heard from another speaker about the verse which seems to very heavily side with the Romans in the war between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire that broke out in 603 when the Iranians attacked and lasted, I would argue, until early 630, and it really overlapped with then the traditional dates for the prophet's ministry. So that was 610 to 632. During most of that time, Iran and the Eastern Roman Empire were at war all around him. So, some of the anxieties in the Quran, especially the early chapters about the end of the world being near, and the chapters about the world being full of menace and violence, are probably reflective of this vast, massive, and very ruinous war in which villages and towns were burned, populations were displaced, entire cities were kidnapped, and this was going on all around the Prophet. And Mecca and Medina were spared the worst of it because they weren't part of either empire, but Tabari and other early authorities believed that the two empires had a politics in the Hijaz in Western Arabia, which may well have affected the Prophet. And Glenn Bowersock, the great classicist, argued that likely the pagans in Mecca were allied with the Sasanian Iranians, and the early Muslim community and the Christians in the Hijaz, and maybe some of the Jews as well, were allied with the Eastern Romans, and that's why you get the verse in the Quran praising the Roman side and predicting its victory after a few years, which the Quran says will be the victory of God. So God is working in history and is going to arrange for the biblical tradition in the form of the Christian Eastern Roman Empire to be victorious over the Zoroastrian. And then the other thing that becomes clear is how much of the Quran is devoted to conciliation and peace in the context of this vast and long-lasting and horrible war. And so there's a great emphasis in the Quran on the peace verses. And I don't want to be immodest about this, because I'm not the first person to recognize the importance of the peace verses in the Quran. Indeed, there's a lot of Quran commentary through Muslim history that makes quite a lot out of these verses and focuses on them. The more hardline kind of medieval tradition of what we would now call, Muslim fundamentalism and maybe Muslim militancy, wanted to argue that a lot of these verses were abrogated by verses commanding war. But there's no reason to think that. That is to say, the Quran doesn't ever say that. And the verses on war in the Quran, which are relatively few, are about the community, and I would argue, defending itself by arms when it's attacked by arms. And I would just point out that that's just exactly the way that Christian theologians of the time looked at things. That is to say, they all believed in turning the other cheek as an individual and working for conciliation as an individual. But they all agreed that the Roman Empire had a right to defend itself by arms if it was attacked. And indeed, often Christian theologians, like St. Augustine, developed a whole doctrine of just war and supported the Christian Roman army, after all, and urged Christians to sign up for it and so forth. And there's this kind of odd disconnect when Westerners talk about the life of the prophet, that they seem to not be able to understand that these two ethical imperatives to defend the community on the one hand when it's attacked by arms, and to act as an individual or a set of individuals to promote peace and conciliation as much as is possible, are not in contradiction and were par for the course and for the world that the prophet lived in. Now, not everybody agreed. There were predatory, ideas about human relations. We now have also another big thing that's changed in the history is that we have what are called Safa'idic or Old Arabic inscriptions have been deciphered. And the early Muslim historians didn't have access to this material. They did go to the pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, but there's 50,000 inscriptions on rocks in the Hijaz and eastern Syria and Jordan, and most of them undated, but they're clearly from about the time of Jesus until about 400 years afterwards, that is to say a couple hundred years before the Prophet Muhammad. There are even some inscriptions from the 500s, and these inscriptions are in an old Aramaic script, which evolved into the Arabic script. In the 400s, 500s, there was an evolution in the script, and that's how you get the script in which the Quran is written. And these inscriptions are short, and there's often invocations to their gods, the North Arabian gods. They mention the goddesses that are that are condemned in the Quran, Alat and Uzza and Manat. They're all there in these inscriptions. And they also talk about feuding and raiding and taking revenge. There's not very much in them about making peace or conciliation. So the ethos of the Arabian tribes obviously was a martial one. And the Quran is very different in that regard. And so the Quran is ethically much more in line with some of the more pacifist Christian traditions of the time than with the martial Arabic inscriptions, and this also shows up in the mu'allaqat and the pre-Islamic poetry, which boast, there are battle days and boasting about one's battles and so forth. And I think one of the things that happened when the Abbasids came to write the history of early Islam is that they were steeped in that Arabic tradition of the battle days, and they were very eager to import it into their understanding of the lifetime of the Prophet. And so they even ordered his life around battles. Some people estimate that the Prophet was probably at war for about 6 afternoons in his lifetime. And so I think the Abbasid emphasis on maghazi or raids is way overdone. So let me talk a little bit about these peace verses, and I'll show you some slides. Peace in Arabic, and it occurs very frequently in these old Arabic inscriptions. Almost all of them mention peace. Salam is beyond just what we think of as peace, as the absence of conflict. In Old Arabic, it meant security, it meant prosperity. So when you're wishing somebody peace, you're actually wishing them to flourish. And obviously you can't flourish in time of war. And so I think probably it's better if I get out of that mode. No, okay. Let's see. So you can't flourish if there's a vicious warfare going on around you. So it does have the implication of that kind of peace as well. And it is a name of God. So in the gathering of 59:23 in the Quran, it says, "He is God other than whom there is no God, the King, the Holy, the Peace, the Defender, the Guardian, the Mighty, the Omnipotent, the Supreme." So the Islamophobes somehow missed that verse when they're talking about the Muslim God. But he's, and notice that if you think about these attributes of God that are given in the verse, and I've given, I don't know if you can see the Arabic below, Al-Muhaymin, and these are attributes of a guardian, of a protector, and a defender. So that's the sense in which God is the peace. He's the peacekeeper. And there are the early verses of the Quran, what we think are, the early preaching of the prophet. The traditional sources say that he preached secretly for 3 years. So that would be 610 to 613. And so in 613, he started preaching publicly. And the Quran gives the firm impression that there were people who found his preaching unwelcome and who ridiculed and harassed him and his early followers. And so we have in Al-Muzammil, chapter 73 of the Quran, verses about this harassment. But what does it say? It says, "Be patient with what they say and take your leave of them graciously. Leave the affluent to impugn you to me, giving them a respite." So the Quran has an instruction to the very early community of believers around the Prophet Muhammad, which is that when they're harassed, when they're taunted, they're to reply by simply absenting themselves from that gathering in which they're treated this way. This, by the way, is a kind of principle of, and it says you shouldn't leave angrily. You shouldn't absent yourself, with returning their insults. It says you should leave beautifully, jamilan, which I have translated graciously in English. And why can you do that? Because you're confident that God will take care of their destiny. It's not on the individual believer to correct these people or to treat them, to respond in kind to their treatment. And this word wasbir, to be patient, that the Quran uses in the languages of late antiquity, also in Christian culture, had to do also with patience and tolerance and forbearance. And there are many Christian essays about the necessity of being patient towards one's enemies. And in the Quran, I would argue that very frequently, and I'm not alone in this, other scholars have made this point, Asma Afsaruddin has made this point, that that patience in the Quran has to do not just with putting up with, but also of forbearance and active tolerance towards. Then we have the criterion, Al-Furqan 2563. And the servants of the All-Merciful who walk humbly upon the earth, and when the unruly taunt them, they reply, peace. So they're being taunted. They're being harassed by al-jahilun. It's often translated the ignorant, but it's not what it means. And in the time of the Quran, the Jahil people are the ones who don't know how to control themselves. They're undisciplined. And the opposite of al-Jahil is not the knowledgeable. The opposite, it's the one in self-control. So it's the one who has hilm, or ability to control their behavior and emotions. So these unruly people are taunting the early Muslim community. And what does the verse say? The servants of the All-Merciful who walk humbly upon the earth, when the unruly taunt them, they reply, peace. So peace is a kind of prayer here for the harassers. And it's a very remarkable verse. That word, humbly, haunan, is a word that doesn't appear anyplace else. So we can't be exactly sure what it means, but the early lexicographers, the people who made the dictionaries and the commentators, believed that it meant something like humble. And this the idea that these are the servants of the All-Merciful prefaces the verse, and the later Muslim commentary literature often put a big stress on this, that it's why is the verse advising them to behave in this way? Because they are exemplars of the notion of mercy. They're the servants of the All-Merciful. And so, Ibad al-Rahman, and therefore, that's why they're being asked to reply peace, to wish peace, to give a prayer for peace upon those harassers. The mystics, the Sufis, went wild with this particular verse. Then we have in the distinguished 4133 through 34.
Okay, John?
Sweetie, I'm giving a talk.
Oh, I see. Okay, so morning on phone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The distinguished 4133 to 34, whose discourse is more beautiful than one who summons others to God and performs good deeds and proclaims, I am a monotheist. Good and evil are not equal. Repel the latter with the greater good, maybe the greatest good, and behold, your enemy will become a devoted patron. This is a really remarkable verse in that I would argue it goes beyond anything in the New Testament. Jesus famously is said to have urged turning the other cheek. But this verse is dialogical. It says, not only should you repel evil with the greater good, billati hiya ahsan, but if you do that, the relationship between you and the evil person is such as to be transformative for the other person. And they then will become your wali, which I believe in the Quran mostly means your patron, the person who's maybe superior to you in social status who does you favors. But this way of behaving is transformative. There's another similar verse in the Surah of Stories, Qisas in 28:50 through 57, and it says, "These shall be given their wage twice over because they patiently endured and avert evil with good and expend of what we have provided them. And if they hear abusive speech, they turn away from it and say, to us our deeds and to you your deeds, peace be upon you, we do not want the rowdy." And so again, when they're being accosted, when they're being treated in this way, they return evil with good. Then there's in the Quran a recognition of, the Deuteronomy principle of an eye for an eye and so forth, which, by the way, historians believe was a way of limiting vengeance, because it was possible that you would take a life for an eye rather than an eye for the eye. But like the New Testament itself, the Quran modifies this. It says, you can ask for equal retribution, but God will recompense whoever pardons and makes peace. So the ethical urging of the Quran is not to practice an eye for an eye, but to be forgiving and to try to achieve reconciliation. I think I'm going to wrap up here. There's more that I could say. And by the way, the verses I've been talking about here are mostly from the Mecca period, but I'm not entirely sure. The consultation verse might be from the Medina period, and in any case, there are also verses about peace and reconciliation in the Medina period, even after these defensive wars have broken out. The Quran says, it may be possible for you to have peace and love with people who had been your enemies before, and so this emphasis doesn't go away through the lifetime of the prophet, in the way that some scholars have argued it does. I tried to trace it all the way through, and so I think there are a lot of these verses in the Quran which haven't been problematized in scholarship as a group. As I said, there's a big commentary literature on them. There are a small minority of scholars who argued that they were abrogated by the verses about warfare, but that's not the majority opinion among scholars, and it's not adopted in many cases by, for instance, a Tabari, an Abbasid era scholar, and some traditions like the Sufis really wrote a lot about these verses and highlighted them and didn't think they were abrogated at all. And so they've been central to the Muslim community, and they've been invoked by people who were actually doing active peace work in their lives and times. They were quoted by modern Muslim movements who used nonviolence in their societal work. And so I'm not discovering anything at all, but I am trying to highlight them and find a way to give them a context. So I'll stop there.